You've got a big story this week that we're going to be talking about here. The credit card companies, the big credit card companies, they made a major decision. What exactly did they do?
Yeah, so Bloomberg actually broke the news Thursday the 9th, as of this recording, that Visa and Mastercard, according to internal sources, said that the MCC code, the merchant category code that everyone was talking about for quote unquote tracking gun sales, which we'll get into a little bit later why that's a bit of a misnomer. But anyway, they were originally going to go forward with this code. They faced a bunch of backlash, a lot of political backlash from gun rights advocates, and now are no longer they're pausing at least the implementation of those codes. And shortly after that announcement, go ahead.
So you actually, Bloomberg broke this story, but you actually talked directly with Visa and Discovery, right? About their decision not to go forward with this?
That's right. Yeah. So Visa, I reached out to Visa just to kind of corroborate Bloomberg's reporting. And they told me that it was in the face of a bunch of impending legislation through, various states across the country. I believe there's 5 or 6, mostly Republican-led states that are either introducing legislation to outright ban the use of these special gun store codes or severely disincentivize their use. And Visa basically said, in the face of all this uncertainty, it's created a lot of chaos for our legal department. So we're just going to pause the code and see what happens, basically. And then that was also echoed by the other companies as well.
Yeah, pretty big news, because this was a major concern for gun owners and gun rights advocates alike throughout the country. Mainly, I think, because of the impetus behind this change, right? So we can talk a little bit about what it actually does, but the concern was that it'll track gun sales and even perhaps deny gun sales or have people reported to the police, right?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people thought that this would essentially be like a de facto registry if it was implemented in the way that a lot of its proponents, frankly, thought that it could be used. So they're not that far off in terms of what the proponents of this move think it's going to do by jumping to that conclusion.
That's how this came about, right? There was a New York Times columnist who suggested this idea of using merchant category codes, which already exist, right? There's hundreds of them that these companies use to put different retailers in different categories. This is how, you get rewards cards, right? So the airlines have a certain merchant category code. And so if you spend money at an airline, that's how your credit card can know that you qualify for the points that they're giving for that recommendation. But the idea behind this wasn't to create, gun buying rewards cards. It was to track gun sales because some mass shooters had used credit cards to purchase guns and ammunition in the lead up to their attacks. So the idea was, well, if we can track these sales and we can identify suspicious patterns of buying, then those consumers can be reported to the police in the same way that, for instance, there's terrorism or fraud, especially fraud monitoring works in this way, where they track suspicious patterns of buying, and then a report is filed with the appropriate authorities to try and investigate this. So the idea was to try and copy that system, and the first step was to implement these merchant category codes. Amalgamated Bank, which is a big union bank, is a sort of an activist bank. A lot of the top Democratic officials use that bank for their banking, and it's often trying to implement financial reforms in line with what liberal activists want. And so they were the ones who proposed this change at the international body that governs these category codes. And, it sort of went through. Initially, it was ignored, and then late last year, it went through and caused a lot of uproar because there was initially opposition from Visa and Mastercard and Discover and American Express, because the industry doesn't want the codes, right? The gun industry doesn't want a specialized code, because I think explicitly because of the people who do want the code and what they want to do with it, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And as you said, for the last few years, it seems a lot of these banks and credit cards have sort of resisted this change. It's sort of mirrors a lot of the same trends that you've seen perhaps in other big industries that have, as of late, pivoted to more, whether you want to call it ESG or more socially conscious policies, where for a while they say, oh, we don't want to dip our toes into this. This is too political. And then suddenly, just out of nowhere, they say, okay, fine, we'll implement your pet project or your social cause, and creates a huge uproar. And as you said, the industry was not happy. Red states, a lot of Republican figures weren't happy with this, and it just creates a big fight and a big blow up. But at least in this case, it seems like that backlash actually, paid some dividends here.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the efforts from Republican lawmakers in places like Florida and Texas to push back on this effort to use legislation to discourage it has actually worked. I think that's one of the big takeaways. I mean, now, to be fair, I suppose they've only said that they've paused this plan.
Right.
They haven't abandoned it. It does seem odd, right, for a financial institution to put a merchant code on an industry that doesn't want the merchant code. The only reason you would do that is because the activists on the other side do want the code, right? Like,
right.
Those are the only people who want the code are the ones who want to try and use it to track people. Now, we should note, right, that what the activists want to use this code for and what it can actually do are two different things at this point, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The MCC doesn't track, granular data. It doesn't tell you what was purchased at a particular store. It doesn't tell you in what quantity something was purchased. It just is a code assigned to a particular retailer that, in this case, may sell guns as part of its business. So, for example, like a Cabela's or something would be flagged by this code, even if you went there to buy, I don't know, camping equipment or something. So it's not exactly the most granular look at what people are doing.
Right. We don't know exactly how that was all going to shake out in terms of like large retailers that also sell guns alongside other sporting goods. But even in retailers that are just literally gun stores, there's a lot of things you can buy from a gun store that aren't guns. Right. And so all the code would tell the credit card company is that you bought something from a retailer that sells guns. So, you can spend $5,000 because this is where a lot of the basic concept that the New York Times columnists came up with and that a lot of gun control activists have run with sort of falls apart, because the idea is, well, if you spend $5,000 at a gun store, maybe that's suspicious and should be investigated. I mean, first off, like, I think trying to find a needle in a haystack in terms of somebody who's likely to like, what pattern is there for mass shooters? You look at some of the examples they gave, and it's really some of these guys just bought a couple of guns and a couple hundred or even a couple thousand rounds of ammunition. That is not an uncommon thing to do if you're a gun owner.
Right.
Like, it's not some suspicious red flag. A lot of people buy a couple guns and a couple thousand rounds of ammunition, and 99.9999999% of them don't turn into mass shooters, if that makes sense. And in addition to that, just spending $5,000 at a gun store, for instance, if you just pick a number, a relatively large number, doesn't even mean you've bought any guns. You could be buying a gun safe or two. And so just having this ability to see how, for these credit card companies, to see how much money you spent at a category of retailer is generally not going to be enough information to create a profile. Plus, it's sort of the base level concept of creating a profile for mass shooters doesn't work either, as we talked about a while back with the United States Secret Service did their report on mass shooters and said there is no profile. That's
Right.
not how this works. So there's a lot of problems with the basic concept. And then what they got is really only a half measure to what they were trying to get to, because in order for it to work the way they even claim that it should work or could work, you'd have to allow the credit card companies to see into the basket, they call it, to see exactly what you're buying when you go to the gun store. Because if you're just buying a gun safe, that's different from buying two, $2,000 guns or 10, or 20, $100 guns or whatever. And so it really was a half-baked concept to begin with, one that was only supported by people who aren't retailers.
Right.
And so it's kind of a weird consideration for these companies to begin with. So I'm not really surprised that they eventually came around to not wanting to do this, because it doesn't do what activists say it would do, and it makes everyone else involved upset. So, not shocked that they've decided to go back on it, but they were going to go through with it right after that. After the governing body said they were implementing it, all these card companies said they would go forward, and now they're saying they're not.
That's right. Yeah. And Discover, in fact, even was going to implement its code as early as next month in April. And so they actually are the only ones that actually had a code ready to go. And even they said, you know what, this isn't worth the trouble. We're pausing and we're going to join all these other companies because this is just getting out of hand.
Yeah. And, American Express will be an interesting one to watch too, because American Express is different from the other credit card companies in that they don't just provide the network. They also provide basically the banking side of things. So they are the bank in addition to being the credit card company. So they can see what you're buying, like your bank can see it. So they know what's in your cart. Now, they don't really need an MCC code to do that, because your bank can already see what you buy, right? They know where you're buying from and what you're buying. The credit card company, the processor, doesn't know this, but your bank does. And American Express is a combination of those two things. And so what they decide to do will be a little more interesting as well, I think. But we'll have to keep an eye on this whole situation. I mean, are they going to just pause it, or are they going to give up on entirely? That's another big question.